That morning started like any other. I was at the kitchen table, coffee steaming in front of me, flipping through the morning paper. Emily was still in the bedroom, getting herself ready for the day. Nothing about this morning felt out of the ordinary, at least not until I saw the headline, just as Tony had said I would. He's a man of his word, always has been. The article reported a man found murdered in his garage, Mark Spencer, someone who worked at Calcas Realty. They said he'd been knocked out and then strangled. Emily worked there too, at Calcas. The police didn't have any leads yet, and the investigation had just started. I didn't need to read anymore. I folded the paper and set it down in Emily's spot at the table. A strange sense of calm washed over me as I thought about how we got to this point. Taking a slow sip of coffee, I waited as Emily finally came into the kitchen. God, she was still as gorgeous as the day I first laid eyes on her. 5 years into marriage, and she somehow looked even better than she did 7 years ago when we met. We didn't exchange a word, hadn't for weeks, really. She just went about pouring herself a cup of coffee, like I wasn't even there. I could hardly believe how much our marriage had gone downhill over the past year. When our eyes met, I gave her a small smile, acknowledging her, but she didn't respond. Not a single word. It had been that way ever since our big argument about her working longer hours. She shut me out after that, growing colder by the day. That warmth I loved in her? Gone. Completely. I missed it, missed what we had. But at this point, it was clear everything between us was unraveling. Emily grabbed the paper with one hand, her coffee in the other. Her eyes swept over the headlines, and then she froze. Next thing I know, she spat out her coffee, staring in shock at the news about Mark Spencer's murder. "Oh God, no!" she gasped, bolting toward the bathroom like she was going to be sick. I didn't move, just sat there, not feeling the need to say anything. I knew better. I stood up, rinsed my cup, and loaded it into the dishwasher. Then I grabbed my briefcase, went out to the garage, and got into my car. I didn't bother checking on her. I'd long stopped caring how she felt. Before I dive deeper into this story, let me tell you a little about myself. My name's Alex Dawson, but my friends call me AD. I'm 29 years old, born and raised in the Italian part of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm of Sicilian blood, and growing up, I got into more than my share of trouble. I ran around with a group of other Italian kids, and we called ourselves the Junior Mafia, thinking we were a lot tougher than we actually were. But I'll spare you most of those stories and get straight to the one that changed everything for me. Tony Ferrara was my best friend back then. We were like brothers, always running with the same crew. The main difference between us? Tony just couldn't stay out of trouble. I mean, neither of us were saints, but somehow, he was always the one getting pinched by the cops. One night, we broke into a warehouse by the docks, hoping to make off with some quick loot. MP3 players, if you can believe that. Problem was, the guards must have been tipped off, because as we were about to leave, they were right there waiting for us. One of them grabbed Tony, and just as I turned to help, another one lunged at me. I tossed a box in his face and then threw myself onto the other guard, hitting him as hard as I could on the side of his head. He let Tony go, and I yelled at him to run. Tony didn't hesitate. He took off, leaving me behind. The second guard managed to get a hold of me, and after that, it was over. They beat me up pretty good before the cops showed. When they arrived, they all had a good laugh at my expense while looking over my bruised face. They dragged me to the station and threw me in a cell until my parents came to bail me out. I never gave Tony up, though. I took the fall. I spent 2 weeks in jail and then got put on probation. Tony called me a bunch of times, apologizing for leaving me there, but I told him not to worry about it. Given his record, he'd have been looking at serious time if he'd been caught. He swore he'd repay me one day, no matter how long it took. My parents were furious. My dad whipped me so hard with his belt that I was almost bleeding. After that, they packed me off to St. Peter's Catholic High School to straighten me out. And it worked. The nuns and priests kept me in line, and by the time I was a senior, I turned things around. One priest in particular took me under his wing and pushed me to change my path. So I did. I left the gang behind and got accepted to Penn State, where I did well for myself. Graduated with a degree in human resources and landed a solid job not long after. For once, my parents were proud of me. I dated plenty of women in college, but never got serious with any of them. That changed 3 years after I graduated, when I met Emily Carson at an HR seminar. I got her number, told her I'd call, and I did. She was thrilled. Emily was different from anyone I'd ever been with, complex, like she had different sides to her. Sometimes she reminded me of Chris Costner's character in The Three Faces of Eve. But the thing that bugged me most about her? Stubborn as hell. Once she made up her mind about something, no amount of reason could change it, even when she was flat out wrong. Our relationship was this weird mix of closeness followed by long stretches of distance. It was a roller coaster from the start. From the start, Emily and I took things slow, avoiding intimacy at first. Within the first year of dating, I found out she had been abandoned as a baby. Her mother had left her in a church pew and disappeared from her life for good. That meant Emily grew up bouncing around between orphanages and foster homes. I've always believed that the lack of a mother's love during her childhood played a huge role in shaping the struggles she had with her personality. Despite all of that, during those early years together, Emily was the most affectionate, kind-hearted person I had ever met. Of course, my parents weren't too keen on her. They didn't approve of our relationship from the start. Every chance they got, they warned me about getting too serious with her, but I wasn't about to listen. I loved her. We eventually got married in a small ceremony at the church. Both of us agreed to wait on having kids until we were more financially stable, so Emily could be a full-time mom. My parents weren't thrilled about that either, but we stuck to our plan. Things started to go downhill in our third year of marriage. Emily's company got bought out by a bigger firm, and just like that, she was out of a job. She took it hard. Even though we weren't struggling for money, losing that job really hit her. For months, she was depressed, not herself at all. It wasn't just about the paycheck, it was about her pride. Eventually, she landed a new job as an office manager at Caucus Realty, but she wasn't thrilled about it. I tried my best to be there for her during that rough patch, but I could tell she resented the fact that I was still thriving at work while she had to settle for something she didn't really want. Her moods were all over the place, especially when her time of the month came around. After a few months at Caucus, though, she started to get back to her old self. Things got better, even in the bedroom, which had taken a serious hit while she was unemployed. I could tell Emily was trying to make up for lost time. For a while, I wasn't complaining. Our marriage seemed to be back on track. For about 9 months, everything was great. Emily threw herself into her new job and even took an online real estate course to advance her career. I was happy to see her so motivated, and for a while, she was the loving wife I'd always wanted. But as life often goes, we hit another fork in the road. Some good news and some bad news came our way. On the positive side, I was moving up in my company. After 5 years, I was being promoted, and my future looked promising. But there was a downside. A merger with a company out of Atlanta meant my job was about to get a lot more demanding. I was put in charge of training their staff and cutting jobs where necessary. It was an exciting challenge, but it also meant more travel, longer trips, and more time away from home. Emily wasn't too happy about it. Even though I made sure to come back on weekends during the longer trips, the distance took its toll. At first, she tolerated it, but as time went on, my weekend visits weren't enough. Emily became bitter. She accused me of actually enjoying being away, and even went as far as suggesting I might have someone on the side in Atlanta. I did everything I could to reassure her, called her multiple times a day, sent flowers, even threw in a few joke cards to lighten the mood. But none of it seemed to make a difference. It took me 6 long months to finish the training in Atlanta, and when I finally got back home for good, I thought things would improve. I had a promotion and no more travel, so I figured Emily would be happy to have me around again. Boy, was I wrong. Instead of being thrilled, Emily buried herself even deeper in her work. She started taking on extra hours at the realty agency, saying she was working toward her own promotion. When I questioned her about it, she hit me with a sarcastic remark, telling me it was her turn to spend the evenings alone while I got to sit at home. Our relationship grew colder by the day. 2 weeks ago, Emily dropped another bombshell. She told me she'd be out of town for the weekend, some developers' conference by the riverfront. She didn't even ask how I felt about it, just told me it was important for her career. I wasn't exactly thrilled with her leaving, but I didn't put up much of a fight. She'd already made up her mind. I guess I was used to it by then. Even though I'd left the whole junior mafia crew behind in high school, I still stayed close with a few of the guys, especially Tony. So, I called him up and asked if he wanted to catch the Steelers game on Sunday. Of course, he was all in. Tony always knew how to snag the best tickets. I mentioned Emily's little business trip, and he suggested we make a weekend of it. The idea of getting away from home sounded too good to pass up, so I didn't even bother telling Emily about my plans. Friday morning rolled around, crisp and chilly. Over breakfast, I casually asked how I could get a hold of her while she was gone. She brushed me off without a second thought, saying she'd be too busy with important people and didn't want to be interrupted. It was like I was some nuisance to her instead of her husband. I didn't push it, and later that day, Emily packed up and headed off to Atlantic City. Meeting up with Tony was exactly what I needed. It had been over a year since we'd hung out, and being with him felt like old times. Out of our whole group, I was one of the few who managed to get out of the neighborhood without ending up in prison. Tony still talked about how he owed me for the warehouse incident years ago, and he said he'd help me out whenever I needed it. Saturday night, we hit the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge on the southeast side of town. It was a sleazy strip club that felt like it was straight out of The Sopranos. The place was packed, filled with barely dressed women dancing around. This one girl, who looked like she had just turned 18, made a beeline for me, dancing right in front of me, provocatively swaying to the beat. Tony leaned over with a grin, hinting that the girl dancing in front of me was available for the night. He made sure I understood she could be mine if I wanted. At the same time, he wasn't exactly subtle, getting handsy with her in a way that made me uncomfortable. I glanced at him and shook my head, reminding him, and maybe myself, that I'd made vows, and those meant something to me. Yeah, the temptation was there, but loyalty still mattered. I turned down the offer, and the girl moved on to another guy who seemed all too eager to take her up on it. Tony looked at me in disbelief, shaking his head like I was crazy. "You're really serious about this fidelity thing, huh?" he asked, clearly amused. "Yeah, man," I said, looking him straight in the eye. "Without it, what do you have? No love, no marriage, nothing." And honestly, I believed that. Even with all the cracks in my marriage, I wasn't about to stoop to that level. The next morning, the cold, windy Pittsburgh weather greeted us as we joined the sea of fans heading to Three Rivers Stadium. The Steelers were up against the Raiders, and that rivalry ran deep, almost like gang warfare on the field. It went all the way back to the infamous playoff game, where Franco Harris grabbed that ridiculous reception and stole the win. Raiders fans never let us forget it, and today wasn't any different. The game was brutal. By halftime, my voice was shot from all the yelling, and the tension in the stadium was thick. But when the clock finally ran out, the scoreboard read Steelers 21, Raiders 20. It was a close call, but we pulled through. Nothing could have made the day better. At least that's what I thought at the time. Tony wanted to celebrate, but I had to pass. There was no way I could handle a hangover with everything going on at work the next day. Plus, Emily was supposed to be coming home that night, and I figured it was better to be there when she got back. So, I told Tony we'd catch up another time. But Emily didn't come home Sunday night. I woke up Monday morning with an uneasy feeling gnawing at me. Something about our marriage had shifted in a way I couldn't shake. Sure, every couple has rough patches, but this felt like more than that. It felt like our marriage had passed the point of no return. The workday hit hard, as expected. Meetings piled up, and I had a major lawsuit against the company that needed my attention. It wasn't until 5:30 that I finally got a moment to breathe and check my emails. Dozens of them were waiting for me, most of them routine. But near the bottom of the list, there was one with a subject line that caught my eye. Who was the last one to know? I clicked on it, expecting some silly joke or a meme. But instead, my screen filled with a photo of Emily. She was locked in a deep, passionate kiss with another man. My stomach dropped. Beneath the photo was a message that read, "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." I stared at the screen, frozen. The image of my wife kissing another man was already more than I could handle, but I clicked the next link anyway. My hand was trembling as I braced myself for what came next. The screen flashed to another photo. This time, Emily and the same man, both naked, standing together in a dingy motel room. At the bottom of the photo, the same message appeared. "Want to know what happened after this? Click on the next link." My throat tightened, and my chest felt like it was caving in. I wanted to stop. Part of me didn't want to see any more. But another part of me had to know the full extent of the betrayal. So, I clicked the final link. That last photo was the one that ended it all. Emily was on the bed, on all fours, with the man from the earlier photos. Her face, twisted with lust and pleasure, was seared into my mind. This was my wife, the woman I had loved with everything I had, and she was betraying me in the worst way possible. At the bottom of the photo, the final blow was delivered, prick provided by Mark Spencer. It was like a knife through my heart. I sat there, staring at the screen, numb. The coldness Emily had been showing me lately, it wasn't just a wife upset with her husband. It was something far darker. Our marriage hadn't just hit a rough patch. It had rotted from the inside out. What followed wasn't the kind of wild rage you'd expect. Instead, it was a calm, icy resolve that settled over me. Revenge, swift and brutal, became the only thing I could think about. Two people were going to pay for this. They had mocked my love, humiliated me, and now they would both feel the consequences. My mind raced with questions. Who sent the email? Why expose Emily's affair to me like this? Were they trying to help me, or was this some kind of twisted game? I didn't know, and at that moment, it didn't matter. I copied the email and the photos onto a CD, then wiped them from my computer. No trace of it left. As I leaned back in my chair, trying to make sense of everything, I couldn't help but think that Emily's behavior had to be tied to her messed-up upbringing. Maybe she had always been broken in ways I couldn't fix. If she had just asked for a divorce, I would have given it to her. We could have walked away clean. But now? Now, she was going to pay for what she did. And so was Mark Spencer. Revenge was coming, and I wasn't going to show any mercy. A plan was already taking shape in my mind. Leaving the office, I walked a few blocks until I found a payphone tucked around the corner. Using the burner phone I kept for situations like this, I called Tony. "It's time," I told him. Time for him to pay back that favor he owed me. When I got home around 7:30 that night, Emily was already there, sitting in front of the TV like nothing was wrong. She didn't get up to greet me, just glanced my way and made a snide comment about me getting home late. I shot back that she was doing the same, and with that, I went straight to the kitchen. The silence between us was deafening. I grabbed a beer, took it to my office, and made sure to lock the door behind me. In this country, when someone's convicted of a serious crime, they're typically handed one of two fates, either the death penalty or life in prison. My plan for revenge followed the same model. One death sentence, one life sentence. I needed some quiet time to finalize the details. Tony would take care of Mark Spencer. I would personally deal with Emily. To make things look like nothing more than a wife abandoning her husband, I started putting on a little show, sent flowers to her office, made reservations for dinner at a restaurant close to her work, and left messages asking her to meet me. Of course, she never showed up. I even made sure the maitre d' remembered me getting stood up. When Emily came home that night, she didn't bother with an excuse. She didn't have to. At that point, I didn't care what she had to say. The wheels were already in motion, and there was no stopping what was coming. The next day, a courier showed up at my office with an envelope marked personal and confidential. Inside, there was just one piece of paper. The first sentence instructed me to destroy the note after reading it. The second sentence gave me a name, Miguel Alvarez, and a phone number. I memorized the number, shredded the note, and took the pieces outside, dropping them into different trash cans around the block on my way out that evening. I got home before Emily, changed into something comfortable, poured myself a tall glass of Jim Beam, and sat back to listen to some smooth jazz. The TV stayed off. It was my night to enjoy the peace of being alone. Emily could figure out her own plans. When she did come home, she took one look at the scene and turned around without a word, heading right back out the door. Where she went didn't concern me. Whether she was meeting a friend or shacking up with Mark didn't matter anymore. Her time was almost up. When she eventually crawled into bed later that night, I didn't stir. The silence between us spoke louder than any words could. I fell asleep easily, knowing what had taken place that night. Mark had received his death sentence. Thursday nights were always poker nights with the guys from work, held in the back room of a dive bar called the Stagecoach. It was the perfect alibi for the evening, airtight. I didn't come home until around 2:35 in the morning, slipping into bed quietly. Emily didn't move, didn't make a sound. Sleep came quickly for me, even though I knew exactly what had gone down that night. Now that Mark was out of the picture, it was time to move on to the second part of my plan. Emily's punishment didn't need to happen immediately. I had time, and the life sentence she had coming would be far worse than any quick ending. All it took was one phone call, and I would be set. I'd let Miguel handle the rest. Whatever was broken inside Emily's mind, the thing that made her treat me like I didn't matter anymore, that wasn't my problem to figure out. I had no more sympathy for the woman I once loved with all my heart. This was her doing, and now she would face the consequences. The police had started their investigation into Mark's murder, interviewing everyone at Caucus Realty. Emily got questioned multiple times, and the detective on the case, David Russo, even tried to feel me out, see if I'd admit to any suspicion about her relationship with Mark. But I didn't give him an inch. I told him I had complete faith in my wife, played the part of the poor, clueless husband. He just smiled at me, probably feeling sorry for me. Mark's funeral was on a Tuesday. That morning, I watched Emily get ready in her somber black dress, the same one she wore to my mother's funeral. She didn't ask if I wanted to come with her, and I didn't offer. Whatever she was feeling about Mark's death, she kept it to herself. I'm sure she had a lot on her mind. The homicide, the affair, everything catching up to her. It was her mess to deal with. Over the next week, Emily tried to talk to me about our relationship. She seemed desperate to have some kind of serious conversation, but I shut her down every time. I was past the point of caring. Reconciliation wasn't on the table. I held all the cards now, and I could end the farce whenever I wanted. 3 weeks after Mark's murder, the police investigation had hit a wall. No new leads. There was talk that maybe Mark had crossed a loan shark or owed money to a bookie. During that time, I watched Emily slowly unravel. She became more absent-minded, paranoid. The smallest things spooked her, but I wasn't about to offer her comfort. I watched her fall apart, and all I could think was, too bad. She had done this to herself. Finally, on the following Thursday, I made the call to Miguel. The plan was in place, and he was ready to execute it. Emily had only a few hours left before her new life would begin. That Friday morning, I left for work before Emily was even out of bed. I didn't want to have one last conversation with her, didn't need to look at her one more time. The hourglass had run out for both of us. Across the street from our house, a car sat parked with 2 men inside, waiting for the right moment. The kidnapping happened at a 4-way stop, where cars blocked Emily's vehicle from both the front and the rear, leaving her no way out. In a matter of seconds, with the precision of a trained Delta Force team, the 2 men moved in. One of them yanked open the driver's door, stuck a needle into her arm, and cut her seatbelt. Before she could react, they shoved her into the passenger seat, and one of the men slid behind the wheel. Just like that, all 3 vehicles took off, the whole thing over in less than half a minute. No one saw a thing. By 11 a.m., over at a branch bank on the east side of town, a woman who looked exactly like Emily walked in. She handed a withdrawal slip to the teller, requesting $25,000 from our joint account. She had all the right identification, a driver's license and a passport. The teller took a few minutes to process everything and then handed her a cashier's check. A security guard even walked her to her car and made a note of the license plate as she drove away. At the American Airlines counter, the Emily lookalike got her boarding pass after showing her ID and passport. The reservation had been made the night before, and the first leg of the trip was to JFK. From there, she'd catch a non-stop flight to Rio de Janeiro on Flight 951. The Pittsburgh flight took off at 4:45 p.m., and by 10:30 that evening, Emily Dawson, or at least the woman posing as her, was on an overnight flight headed for Brazil. I waited until noon on Saturday to call the police and report Emily as missing. To my surprise, Detective David Backton showed up to take the report. I told him Emily hadn't come home the night before and that her phone had been going straight to a not in service message. I even called Rachel Martin, one of her friends from Caucus Realty, who told me Emily hadn't shown up for work the day before and hadn't called in either. Backton scribbled down notes, looking up at me every so often with a cryptic expression. Then he started digging into our marriage, asking if there had been any issues between us that might explain her disappearance. I stuck to the same story I'd told him during the investigation into Mark Spencer's murder. I told him our marriage was fine and that I had no reason to believe Emily would just up and vanish on her own. He asked if I had anything to do with Emily's disappearance. I gave him the best performance of my life, swearing I loved my wife and would never hurt her. Lying to the cops? Well, I learned that skill years ago, running with the junior mafia, and I hadn't lost my touch. 3 days later, Backton showed up at my office, probably trying to get a read on the kind of man I was. He sat down with a tight smile, while I made sure to look every bit the distressed husband. I asked him if there was any news about Emily. He told me they had pieced together some of her movements after she left the house on Friday morning. Some of it good, some not so good. Witnesses had spotted her at a Denny's on Bennett Street around 10 a.m., sipping coffee. Then, at 11, video surveillance caught her at Allegheny National Bank, where she withdrew $25,000 from our joint account. Backton said the teller had made copies of her driver's license and passport before issuing the cashier's check. He was sure that when I saw the footage, I'd recognize the woman at the counter as Emily. I played the part, acting shocked, asking how that was even possible. Emily hadn't mentioned needing to withdraw such a large amount. He watched me closely, waiting for my reaction. I stuck to my script, telling him it had to be a mistake, that Emily and I shared everything, and she'd never do something like this without telling me. But I could tell Backton wasn't buying it entirely. He wasn't finished yet. He saved the biggest bombshell for last. Emily had bought plane tickets to New York and then to Rio de Janeiro. They found her car abandoned in the long-term parking lot at the airport. According to flight records, she had flown out of Pittsburgh at 4:45 p.m. on Friday and caught a connecting flight to Rio later that night. He told me they had already reached out to the authorities in Rio, but it seemed like she had disappeared once she landed. Now Backton's eyes were locked onto mine, waiting for how I'd react to this new information. I threw my hands up in disbelief, telling him this was insanity. Emily would never run off like that. I emphasized again how much I loved her and how much she loved me. As I said that, I let myself tear up, playing the role of the devastated husband to perfection. Backton didn't say anything for a moment, just let the silence hang in the room. Finally, he asked if I thought this could be connected to Mark Spencer's murder. I acted outraged, asking how he could even suggest that. I asserted firmly that my wife had no part in Mark Tolson's murder, reminding Detective Backton that Emily had already been interviewed and never charged. The detective clarified that while Emily hadn't been charged, she had been high on their list of suspects. I pushed back, expressing disbelief that office gossip could turn into a murder accusation. You need more than that to pin a homicide on someone, I said, meeting his eyes with defiance. Backton explained they were still investigating, but Emily's sudden disappearance only fueled their suspicions about her role in the crime. He went on to share something that made me pause, a chilling detail about the murder. Mark Tolson had been tortured for hours before being strangled. There was a sickening, carnal undertone to the whole thing. I couldn't help but let out a small laugh at the absurdity of it. My petite wife, capable of something like that? The idea was laughable. Emily can barely open a pickle jar, I shot back. You really think she could strangle a man? Frustration crept into my voice as I addressed the detective. Sure, all the evidence might point to her, but you've got nothing solid. And now you think she had help? I raised an eyebrow, half-jokingly questioning whether they were about to accuse me of being involved. Backton hesitated, then said they'd considered the possibility, but that I had a solid alibi for the night of the murder. The way he said it, though, made me think he wasn't entirely convinced. I summed up the situation, making it clear that I found it ridiculous they thought Emily left the country because of a homicide. Then I paused, glaring at him. Is that what you're saying? That I helped her escape? I asked, waiting to see if he'd admit it outright. He didn't flinch, just sat there, sizing me up. Finally, I leaned back, a trace of scorn in my voice as I told him if there was nothing else, the meeting was over. Rising from my desk, I walked to the door, opening it for him. Backton slowly got up and walked out, offering a curt, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Dawson. We'll keep you informed about your wife's disappearance." No handshake, no formalities. After he left, I sat back in my chair, going over the entire conversation. It was clear to me that his visit wasn't about updating me on Emily. He was fishing for something, anything, that would give him more to work with. But I had nothing to worry about. My alibis were rock solid. I was playing poker the night Mark was killed, and I was in meetings the whole day when Emily disappeared. 2 weeks had passed since Emily vanished, and I still hadn't heard from Miguel or Tony. Emily's whereabouts remained a mystery, but I wasn't losing sleep over it. Occasionally, I got the feeling someone was tailing me, but it never rattled me. I kept to my routine, work, home, maybe a grocery run. There was nothing suspicious about my behavior. Every other day, I called Detective Backton, asking for updates on Emily. He never had much to say. The Brazilian police had turned up no sign of her after she landed in Rio. That Saturday afternoon, I ordered a pizza from Domino's and settled in to watch some college football. When the doorbell rang, I paid the delivery guy, handed him a tip, and took the pizza to the kitchen. When I opened the box, I noticed an envelope sitting on top. Inside was a single sheet of paper with instructions for the next day. It told me to dress for church and attend the 10 o'clock Mass at St. Peter's. I was to slip out the side door during communion, where a dark Ford Crown Victoria would be waiting. As I held the note, it became clear this was it. My final meeting with Emily before Miguel made sure she was gone for good. He had waited 2 weeks to ensure the trail led nowhere, that Emily's flight out of the country was the only thing the police could follow. Miguel had pulled off an elaborate deception, ensuring that as far as the police were concerned, Emily was alive when she boarded that plane. They couldn't make a case against me with no body. It was perfect. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling. The past few months had been nothing short of a nightmare since I'd received that first damning email. All the events that unfolded reminded me of one thing. No matter how much I tried to escape it, my Sicilian roots ran deep. Disrespect, betrayal, they brought out the darkest side of me. I realized I wasn't the kind of man to let those things slide. St. Peter's is a large church, with a crowd of hundreds attending the 10 o'clock Mass. It would be easy to blend in and lose anyone following me. If the police were outside, waiting, they'd have a hard time spotting me in the throng of people moving toward the altar. When communion started, I slipped out the side door. The dark Ford was waiting, engine running. I climbed into the back seat, and we sped off. The ride took about 10 minutes before the car pulled up in front of a large warehouse. The driver never turned around, just told me to enter through the side door. Inside, the place was mostly empty, except for an office area near the back with some lights on. As I approached, Miguel stepped out, finally meeting me face to face for the first time. He greeted me casually, saying Tony had told him it was all right to call me AD. We shook hands. His expression remained unreadable, but he warned me that Emily wasn't the same woman I once knew. She's been through a lot. It won't be easy to see her like this. I told him I didn't care about how she looked or what she'd been through. I was long past that. Is she on meds? I asked before entering the room. No, Miguel replied, but she probably wishes she was. She's been kept clean, fully aware of everything. She's broken now, trained for her new life. Inside, Emily was tied to a chair, her eyes dull, lifeless. I walked around her, finally stopping in front of her. She didn't say a word, didn't even look at me. Her gaze was distant, fixed on something over my shoulder. The spark in her eyes was long gone. I spoke calmly, telling her that for the rest of her life, she would remember this moment, the misery she brought on herself. I reminded her of all the coldness, the mood swings, the infidelity, and the utter disrespect she had shown me. I told her Mark had already paid his debt, and now it was her turn. She needed to know that it was me who had orchestrated everything, who had delivered the justice she deserved. I let her know Miguel had assured me she'd be well taken care of wherever she was going, treated as well as the finest horses and cattle. As I stood there, a single tear welled up in Emily's eye. It was the only acknowledgement she gave me before I turned and walked out. The sedan dropped me back at St. Peter's just as Mass ended. I slipped inside, blending into the crowd as if nothing had happened. Then I drove home, poured myself a tall Jim Beam, and drowned the knot in my gut. It's been 3 years since that day. Emily is nothing more than a distant memory, and I've scrubbed all traces of her from my life. I sold the house we shared, and the cases backed in was chasing have long since gone cold. I spend most of my time at the Sweet Kitty Cat Lounge with Tony, and I've enjoyed the company of that sweet young stripper more than a few times. Marriage? No thanks. My years with Emily taught me that women are more trouble than they're worth. My parents had warned me, and they were right. If only I'd listened. I later found out it was Rachel Martin who sent me that email, the one with the damning photos. She'd been Mark's lover before he ditched her for Emily. I never thanked her, and I still don't know how she got those pictures. But I guess she got her revenge, just like I did. They say there's no wrath like a woman scorned, and now I know it's true.